Okay, so welcome to Anti-Oedipus Reading Group 5, I believe this is. We've finally, and I think this probably will happen a few more times, we've finally sort of had a digression in the text where we've jumped ahead to something. This is fairly common in Anti-Oedipus. Like, you will have noticed so far that it's not structured in such a way like many philosophical texts or many textbooks are, in that the authors would say this is what all these definitions are, and then they'd use those definitions. Deleuze and Guattari's way of explaining and defining definitions is by using them, and there's obviously points where they sort of finally get down and say, well, this is what we mean by it. But really, the way that they define definitions is by using them in certain contexts, which is often why it's so hard to define them, and you'll find scholars sort of debating actually what the definition of certain things are, such as schizophrenia and body without organs. So in terms of that, this is why the text is sort of non-linear in a certain way, and I think at certain points Deleuze and Guattari actually said something along the lines, it might have been more in relation to A Thousand Plateaus, but they said something along the lines of that their sort of ideal reader would be someone who's so deterritorialized from the text that they actually don't know what the hell it is at all, and they just jump in at any certain point, and in that way that the ideas and concepts that are coming forth from the book wouldn't be Oedipalized in the way that they are for people who've already studied philosophy, which is an interesting idea, but I think you just wouldn't be able to grasp it at all. So this is why, the reason why we're jumping ahead now, we would be looking at the three syntheses, which are in Anti-Oedipus. That would have been the next section chronologically. But Bill, who's the other person in the chat here who is contributing a lot to these discussions, noted that if we jump forward to the section on social repression and psychic repression, which I extended just to the neurosis and psychosis, because that's a very short section, that we would actually be able to go back and understand the three syntheses more. So I'm just going to open here with a brief overview of this section with regards to social repression and psychic repression. What we're looking at is the relationship between social and psychic repression, wherein the latter there, psychic repression, that denotes something such as an unconscious, incestuous taboo. The question of whether it relates to the unconscious is also a secondary question here with regards to the Oedipalizing that happens via psychoanalysis, as we're in the psychoanalytical sort of chapter of sorts. Beginning with the idea that multiple classical repressions are created by the very systems which seek to uncover them. Stating one should not, fuck their mum or dad. The psychoanalyst is actually creating a coded idea or desire wherein the subject wants to do that, due to the very fact that it's been coded as a taboo by the psychoanalyst. So it's sort of being Oedipalized in that way, and because something's Oedipalized as a taboo, it is actually something that you then sort of head towards. And there is actually a term for this in terms of modern psychology and modern therapy, in which I can't remember what it is, but basically there's a term which is that a symptom, or a psychological or even a physical symptom, will arise in the analysand, or the those who are being counselled, will arise because the therapist mentioned it. So it's sort of like a psychosomatic psychic problem, wherein someone might have never even thought they had OCD or something like that, and the therapist might mention something along the lines of, well, a couple of the symptoms there you've got is OCD. They go out, they look up what OCD is, and they look into it more, and they go, oh, I've got OCD. So something arises from the sort of Oedipalization of it in language as something coded. There's a really interesting history on this, specifically with regards to, I believe it's bulimia, I think, in which like the cases of this illness or psychic problem shot up as soon as it's defined, and as soon as we actually define a lot of problems, we see that the cases go up, because we finally have this sort of like coded manner of doing it. Anyway, once again, we revert to Reich's quote right from the start with respect to Foucault about why we wish to subjugate ourselves. Why do we wish to enter into these arrangements where things are taboo, and we're guilty by association with these desires or these repressions. Oedipus then, for Deleuze and Guattari, is sort of psychic propaganda. Desire is repressed so that these desires actually become desired by the very fact that they're depressed. And I recently spoke to Todd McGowan just a few days ago, which sort of helped me think about this discussion, and he actually has a great play on this where he believes that the reason I mention this is because he believes it's in his book Capitalism and Desire, which is actually related to Freud a lot, so it's heavily related to this chapter. He believes that the dissatisfaction that everybody gets within capitalism is actually what keeps capitalism going. So the fact that we have everything we want in capitalism, and yet every time we get what we want, every time we get our desires, and we can get every single desire, the dissatisfaction we get from never actually feeling fulfilled from a desire is what keeps it going. You're like, well, okay, I'll go for the next one and the next one. This one didn't work, but the next one will. And what's peculiar in that question is, well, why the hell do we keep going on even though we're never fulfilled? So social repression, Deleuze and Guattari state, social repression needs psychic repression precisely in order to form docile subjects and to ensure the reproduction of the social formation, including its repressive structures. So the creation of repressions and desires is a matter of familial and societal intervention, as much as societal repression needs psychic repression. The subject's psychic repression is outflanked by familial values, flows, and signs, which seek to create a propaganda and a structure of normalcy, unification, which thus creates from it that which must not fit and thus must be repressed as a forbidden social desire and thus a psychic repression. So it's, once again, we're entering into another loop where neither one of these things really seems to be the originary position. I'll just say a few words on neurosis and psychosis, which begin relatively straightforward. So D and G begin from Freud's actually very, very articulate definition of them both. So in neurosis, the ego obeys the requirements of reality and stands ready to repress the drives of the id, wherein psychosis, the ego is under the sway of the id and ready to break with reality. Deleuze and Guattari state that such manifestations of a loss of reality aren't due to a sort of antagonistic relationship with the Oedipal familiarity itself, but with Oedipus acting as an interruption against the subject's desires. So Oedipus is a matter of conversion, a sort of a neurotic attachment to a set of values, or a psychotic detachment from those values. And as far as I can see, each mode, either the neurotic attachment or the psychotic detachment, is still in relation to Oedipus in the way that it's structured, as if someone has to be in one of those modes. So I'm going to hand over to Bill because he wants to sort of clarify a lot of stuff in this section. So yeah, take it away, Bill.
Yeah, so what I like about this section, at least it shows, at least, so the title Anti-Oedipus, I'm not a big fan of that title because it's not really, I think, at least when I read this also, it created a lot of misunderstandings of what they really meant by being anti-Oedipal, right? So the important thing we need to all remember is that they're not denying Oedipus, right? I think they almost affirm everything psychoanalysis has to say, right? And they're very interesting parallels that I think it's only been recently in terms of psychoanalytic development that I think most, even most Lacanians and Freudians have been really coming across to this discovery since this book was first published, that, there's, they give psychoanalysis a lot of, they affirm it a lot. And it's what they start reacting to are essentially the dogmatics, the people who are, the people who don't really understand what's actually going on here. So in many ways, at least rather than anti-Oedipus, I see it anti-Oedipus in the sense that it's a critique of Oedipus in the same way that Kant uses the word critique, right? It's understanding the limits and the dogmatic presuppositions or assumptions we have concerning the epistemological understanding of grasping the knowledge of a particular subject. And so this Kantian structure is actually, they say it. If you read the interviews in Two Regimes and Madness, Deleuze says, me and Guattari, we were trying to do a rewriting of the Critique of Pure Reason. And in this regard, we understand the syntheses as the syllogisms, right? And the fact that they're productive is going back to that whole idea within transcendental empiricism that you not only have to explain how the categories are responsible or the condition for experience, but they've to explain their genesis, and by explaining by the genesis of the categories, you in turn find not just all the possible conditions of all possible experience, but the conditions of all real experience. Now, what we're going to be introduced to in their set of critique of Oedipus is in this regard that psychoanalysis has 5 paralogisms. And we're going to analyze these paralogisms. The paralogism is essentially, in the Kantian sense, that to be vulgar with it, is essentially it's attributing the wrong conditions for our knowledge of something to the incorrect presupposition in a way. It's essentially dogmatic thought or really speculative metaphysics that doesn't conform to our understanding of what's a priori in a way. And so Deleuze and Guattari will identify 5 paralogisms that occur in the case study of psychoanalysis. So the reason I actually chose this chapter about social repression and psychic repression is because it very clearly accounts what the role of these two organizations are. Essentially, social repression is so a good example is the conscious operation, and psychic repression is the unconscious operation. But it starts to get really much more complicated in the sense that social repression. So an example that they give is the prohibition of incest, where you're told not to. It's when you're prohibited something, the desire for that thing gets created. Essentially, what they're trying to analyze throughout this chapter is how desires are created. Right. The main thesis is that desire is so malleable in this way that essentially it's society and desire is revolutionary in the sense that society tries to prevent it from being actualized in its syllogistic condition of desire production. But in this sense, we must consider that essentially the way social repression works is it's the prohibition of incest in this regard. That by saying no to something, your desire actually goes towards that one thing, and it's only from the prohibition that we can actually transgress in a way, and our desire to transgress. I think Buchanan has a nice example of. In the U.S., there was a whole thing about prohibiting sex before marriage, but it's only after from that prohibition that we can break the law of saying let's have sex before marriage. And now the question is that how is it possible that from this sort of prohibition of incest that we can have the incestuous desire? And the role they say is because we have our subjectivity, at least the way subjectivity is produced under the nuclear family, is that of a docile subjectivity, essentially in the sense that our subjectivity is one of guilt, or maybe even resentment, as Nietzsche would say. I'm not so sure about the Nietzschean part, but in the sense that essentially when social repression, so the role of social repression is to use psychic repression as a tool, and psychic repression causes us to essentially, in a way, desire more social repression. So psychic repression in this regard is referring to the operation that takes place in the family, and this operation. And this operation in this regard is that what occurs in the body without organs. The body without organs has an ambivalence to it because it's a recording apparatus. So one thing that you'll notice it's doing here is that it records Oedipal representations in the family. Now, we skipped the previous chapters, but it goes very in depth into how it records global persons rather than part objects. And what we find in the previous chapters, the one before this, is that from this recording operation, through the production of anti-production, the creation of a body without organs, the body without organs can also record repressing factors, and that happens by psychic repression in the nuclear family. And it is by that regard the cycle of social repression is allowed to complete itself, and you get an Oedipalized desire in the conclusion. So that's what I wanted. That's essentially, at least that's a very quick sort of rundown of how this system works. I don't think I got everything right, spot on, but essentially what we get then when we start talking about neuroses and psychoses is that there's another operation that takes place because for this recording process, we also have we have 2 inscriptions, right? We have a paranoiac inscription, and that's the repulsion of sign connections by the body without organs, and we have a miraculating inscription, that of where the body without organs records everything. And now the schizo, quite a practical question arises: is that why do we have an autistic schizo, right? Because they say that there are two schizos. There's the schizo whose processes ended early, and there's the schizo who takes it to the very limit. And the autistic schizo, or the catatonic body in this case, is the body without organs that suffers full paranoid repression, right? That's what they say. If the process is botched, what the schizo will do is the schizo will escape onto the full body without organs. The way he does this is essentially all that psychic repression, aka the recording of representations onto a body without organs. The schizo repulses them, and in a full paranoiac investment, they repulse everything. By repulsing everything, they fall into the full zero intensity of the body without organs, and that's essentially a state of catatonia for them, where they become, the autistic ragus Judge Schraber, who's living without intestines, or Artaud, who's like at a state. It's basically it's a very I think it's a very clear example of the Freudian debt drive in a way. It's something like that. I think I've definitely missed a lot, but at least that's some of the key things that I tried to garner from the thing. Essentially, what they're comparing is by referring to paralogisms, they're talking about a transcendent use of the syntheses, which is evident in the nuclear family, versus an immanent use, which is the natural use, at least the schizo who lives outside the symbolic order experiences.
Okay, so there's a lot going on here. So if anyone has any questions for the stuff me and Bill mentioned here, please let us know, because I think there's a lot of working parts here that we could look into. Okay. Okay, Bill, I would ask you, do you think that there's... okay, someone's asked a question, actually. What is exactly meant with transcendental here? It seems to me that Deleuze and Guattari's alterations of Kant's three syntheses, which seems to be what the three syntheses we're going to be talking about next session is basically in the same framework, except that it's altered towards a philosophy of immanence, which is a relatively difficult thing to discuss. But with Anti-Oedipus, it just seems to be working on more of a psychological and social level. Like we mentioned in the start, when I sort of articulated the actual and the virtual, and someone pointed out to me that even though they're kind of helpful terms to use, the virtual doesn't really appear in this book that much at all, like twice. And they're really the Deleuzean... Bill, it does?
It does, but it's a very controversial use. That's the problem.
Okay, is it like a different use than what's used in difference and repetition?
So my interpretation, it is. This is once you get into Deleuze scholarship, you get into a complete mess. Like some people like Buchanan think that they're talking about the virtual in the same way, in that they're, so difference in repetition, right? The virtual plays the role of the potential here. And, but that's if you look at the virtual in a very abstract way. If you sort of ignore the Bergsonian idea and ignore the whole idea about time and the three syntheses of time, and, even maybe the will to power, how it's used as an intensive property for indifference and repetition. If you ignore that and you just say something really general, like the virtual is just, the potential, a potential that can be actualized, and that can be actualized on a contingent basis, then you can use the word virtual in my interpretation, in this book at least, and I think that's the way they're using it. At least that's my interpretation. But that this is sort of a debated issue, I think, in Deleuze scholarship.
So the importance for you is regards to virtuality has to be understood in relation to intensity.
Again, I wouldn't. Yeah, I would say let's not. One thing we can't do is because I've seen some people like James Williams, right? He confuses the virtual as the same thing as the intensive, which I think I disagree with. Right, it's a process of going from virtual to intensive, and you see a similar thing happening here, at least for the most part, in my opinion, when they talk about I mean, the way they use the third synthesis and appropriate that for Nietzsche's eternal return, and it's the eternal return of difference. It's a similar thing that's actually going on in the third synthesis. I think there might be a closer parallel to logic of sense, because logic of sense has the, it has the connective, disjunctive, and conjunctive synthesis all together at once in logic of sense. But yeah, I think I think I'd agree with your point, as long as we don't focus on temporality a lot. But I don't think it's that a big issue to get boiled up on. I think if we just consider it as something potential, but then it's not actual, and that's at least the way they describe it, right? Even you see the way they write it, it's just like, oh, we're just saying it's about something that's potential, that's not actualized yet, but can be actualized on a contingent basis. That's essentially what they're talking about in this regard. I wanted to quickly answer this question, though. Do they use the terms transcendent and transcendental differently? And isn't the schizo process also transcendental to some degree? And so this is funny, because if you go back to Kant, right, there's the whole distinction between what Kant was trying to do was with a transcendental critique was that he was trying to find the immanent criteria for understanding something, right? So it was, everyone called it the Copernican epistemological revolution, where we understand, what criteria do we understand something as? What's the a priori condition for understanding our knowledge on certain things? And so transcendental, at least it refers, for Kant, so it's essentially, to be vulgar with it, it's the conditions of all possible experience. That's what so a transcendental critique is a critique which understands reason to find all the possible conditions of using reason in a specific way, and thus we find the immanent criteria, right? Because we're looking at something based on, we're analyzing the structure of our mind, in the sense that we're asking, what are the possible, to have experience of something, what conditions have to be there, and whatever conditions don't conform to this for all possible experience, then that can be deemed as transcendent and not immanent. The problem is that Kant uses the word transcendental, and that sort of throws everything out of loop, in my opinion. It just kind of makes it hard to understand. But so Deleuze and Guattari, right there, he says it's transcendental empiricism, and I think, at least my interpretation is, I think it's pretty much Kantian, post-Kantianism, in my opinion, like coming from that tradition of Ernst Cassirer and people like that, in the sense, well, it's not, it's not the same as that, but in terms of their argumentation style, I think it's exactly in parallel with how Kant does his thing, in the sense that, the three syntheses, as we saw in the first chapter, refer to the immanent criteria of experience, and the three syntheses that we experienced in chapter 2, which are essentially what they call the three paralogisms. Later on, these two chapters, we're getting the last two, but what were called the three paralogisms of the three syntheses are essentially the transcendent use of the syntheses, as opposed to the immanent use that we find in chapter 1. And the transcendent use in this regard is, it's how psychic repression works in the family, and that's what they refer to as the transcendent use rather than immanent use. And so there's another question is also asking, but isn't the schizo process also transcendental to some degree? So it's transcendental in the sense that it's immanent. That's what they're saying. I mean, Kant also uses the word transcendental when he's describing something immanent, and as opposed to transcendent. Sometimes they also use the word transcendental to refer to some sort of extremely spiritual experience. When the schizo passes to the full egg on the desert, that's when they use transcendental to refer to like an out of body experience or something. But that has to do more with delirium in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on these three questions. I basically agree with everything Bill says, but I just want to add in some own thoughts of my own. So, when Gilles says what is meant by transcendental here, I'm in complete agreement with Bill in terms of just understand transcendental as the conditions of experience. But the importance of, well, that sounds really obvious now, but it seems obvious after Kant. Kant was basically the first philosopher to actually analyze the conditions of experience as opposed to the experience of conditions. The way I like to think of this is philosophers prior to Kant begun from definitions and then analyze the world from those pre-assumed definitions. Kant's whole point is, well, if you're beginning from a definition, you are already going to be wrong because you need to analyze the conditions of that definition that you're moving towards. So that's what transcendental is, the conditions of whatever the experience is. The transcendental context is within that, or in general, the conditions of experience. So in complete agreement with Bill, the transcendent and transcendental, as Bill said, it's two-letter difference, and it's like and almost like an opposite difference. So it's very frustrating. So transcendent is what when people sort of like when enlightened people say, "Oh, I transcended," they went beyond and above. It's good to think of transcendent like that, because it marks the why in a transcendental frame that's actually incorrect. So, and this ties in with the schizo processes' transcendental question, which is that for the for man within a transcendental reality, there isn't really any such thing as levels as below, above, beyond, which is always the difficulty people have with like the body without organs. Like, well, where are the body without organs? It's like, well, when we're talking about an immanent philosophy, there isn't these places. And any time that language such as this is used, I really think it's used in a like just a utility to make, like Michel Serres uses it a lot. It's just like, a better argument would be to say, when they talk of the plane of immanence, it's like people go, well, where is that? Where is that? It's like, if it's not above, it's not below. This isn't how it works. This language is used to just for us to be able to encapsulate it. So what's going on is that when we're talking about transcendental, the big alteration for Kant is that because our reality is subjective, there are levels, but there aren't levels on an entirely objective level, or objective reality. So objective reality includes the entirety of whatever reality is, right, of all experience. But on a subjective level, the transcendental reality of man is represented to him. So we are within a subjective reality of our own creation via our cognition, hence transcendental idealism, that our mind objects are thus created by our mind, and there isn't just some objective object where our mind has to process them first, like wearing some blue tinted sunglasses. It would make everything appear blue. That's the problem for Kant, and why we need to assess the conditions. That's sort of the level we're in, right? So that does actually imply a level, but the level is entirely subjective. So this is where the whole thing of schizo processes as transcendental come in. It's like they're not transcendent, because that would mean they're actually going beyond the whole transcendental reality, which you can't do. But they are transcendent within the transcendental to a certain degree, sort of aesthetically. So they're transcendent in the way that they can outflank subjectivity. That's how I see them. So the way to understand Deleuze and Guattari transcendentally, in terms of Kantianism, is that when you have representation, that is the world being represented to you because you have to cognize it via your brain, all limitations and all constraints are within phenomenal. They're phenomena. And everything that's going on within that is entirely subjective. Now, any sort of attempt to overthrow a limit or overthrow a frontier within that is already failed, because you're still actually within a limit of phenomena. Whereas why the schizo processes are transcendental is because they're working on the level of the virtual, which is in the noumenal level, which is why it's like you're pushing something to the extreme on the virtual level, which is a schizophrenic process, which is transcendental because it's outside of human phenomenal action. So that would be the 2 points I would make there, but I would sort of want to clarify that transcendent, when used by Deleuze and Guattari, I don't think I'd ever argue that it's used in this sort of classical sense of like, oh, I'm transcending whatever, I'm becoming enlightened and transcending. Deleuze especially would not abide by that, because immanent philosophy is horizontal. Everything is horizontal, and everything is on the same plane, even though there's no such thing as levels. It's just a way to think about it. But their interactions are, shall we say, in quotation marks, leveled by the way in which whatever those things are conditioned. So humans are conditioned to experience every reality in a certain way. So so there is the conditions are what alter our relations and would imply this sort of pseudo transcendent ability.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of explaining it. The key thing is that the schizo is at the stage. The reason they say is that the schizo is at the heart of the very real, and it's a key thing in this chapter, right? Because what Freud said about the schizo was that the schizo was detached from reality, but Deleuze and Guattari say is that the schizo is the most connected individual to reality itself. He lives the real itself. What he experiences is the real, and that's because the schizo in their way is the subject that corresponds to their immanent criteria, or actualizes their immanent criteria in the way. The immanent criteria being that of desired production. I mean, the key improvement over Kant, at least, or the key thing that makes them post-Kantians rather than Kantians, is that what they're doing is that they also are, they're asking the same question that Maimon asked, Solomon Maimon, who was one of the first critics of Kant at that time, where they asked the question of, like, reason, for Kant had reason. Maimon said that reason had to engender the categories. And the categories can't just be explained as something a priori. They had to have a genetic principle, and that reason had to engender them. So you have to explain the genesis of the categories. And Deleuze and Guattari do the same thing with desire, where desire engenders the categories itself with the three syntheses, and that's the break they make to make it, rather than the conditions of all possible experience, to make it the conditions of all real experience, at least in Anti-Oedipus. And, well, they take it further in 1,000 Plateaus, but it's sort of the implicit basis of Anti-Oedipus.
So what's your point there about there is a hierarchy of intensity, Bill?
Yeah, so this is another thing, like, you're talking about the plane of immanence, right? So, yeah, what Deleuze means by when he says something like everything is a machine, what he's saying that everything is it's almost like everything's ontologically equivalent. That's why everything is a machine. Except, you have different kinds of machines. You have a desire machine, and you have a body without organs machine. But everything's in the machine, that it's a univocal word coming from Duns Scotus, which Deleuze changes from Nietzsche and Spinoza. But everything is a machine in the sense that they all share the same ontological value, and that's why it's fully immanent. However, based on interactions, right? Because these things interact with each other. When they interact, there's a hierarchy of intensity that develops. And so there is still sort of a hierarchy there, but it still manages to place itself in a complete plane of immanence and a horizontal plane of immanence, as you said.
So does anyone have any questions so far, or questions about something in this passage which they'd like us to comment on?
I have a question about something that they talk about in the middle of page 120. They're talking about how the family sort of takes over and interferes with the non-familial genealogical recording of desiring production. And they say, I'll just read out this quote. Under the precocious action of social repression, the family slips into and interferes with the network of desiring genealogy. It assumes the task of alienating the entire genealogy. It confiscates the Newman. But see here, God is daddy. And here I just want a little bit clarification, because now here, Newman, they're saying God is the Newman, and that by putting him in this Oedipal triangle and making him the daddy figure, you're confiscating him. But I guess I just wanted more clarification on what it means for this figure to be confiscated by being put in the Oedipal triangle.
So essentially what they're on about there is, I tried to go over a bit about this, is the way psychic repression works is by a process of recording. And recording happens because the body without organs, right? The body without organs it's almost like it doesn't judge what it records. It either records or it repulses. When it fully repulses everything, it becomes, you become like the autistic rag, as they describe. But when it starts to record, it can record partial objects, but it can also record repressing representations. And that's the recording of the Oedipal triangle. the daddy mommy me complex. So what they're referring to is, the noumenal energy. That's when libido goes into the body without organs, it gets converted into noumenal, and noumenal energy changes, right? So one of the things they say is that the disjunctive synthesis, at least for the schizo, and at least the way we understood it was an inclusive disjunction, right? It's either or. The schizo is, it's free to all these sort of, it's their libido is able to connect with all these sort of differentiations everywhere. And at least when we reach the inscription that's a sort of the familial inscription in this case that they're describing, the libido gets trapped, and it gets trapped in the sense that it gets forced and gets pushed into a libido that's desiring an Oedipal complex. And it's fine if you don't actually understand this. I just wanted to say that this, because it makes, when we read when they talk about the disjunctive synthesis in the prior chapter, it'll all get so much clearer.
So is it saying that it's confiscating the numen, because when you record the numen on the body without organs as an Oedipal figure of the father, you're recording it in the wrong way, and thus you are confiscating what could have been a more true understanding or recording of the numen? Is that correct?
Yeah, I would agree with that. But let's be careful, at least with the way we use the word "true," right? Because these things are all happening in reality. But let's just say it's one use versus the other.
Okay, gotcha.
Or as they say, it's an imminent use versus a transcendent use. The imminent use being that of desiring production for the schizo, and the transcendent use being at least the one we're seeing happening in the family.
One thing, so Trans Republic there said about transcendent and in the transcendental, and I think this is something I probably want to get into a recording because I think it's kind of important. So let me see how I could just think about this. If we start, I'll try keep this fairly short. Okay, so we begin from the Kantian understanding of reality, which is that if you are a subject, a man, a human, the way in which you perceive reality is via your brain, your cognition. So everything you perceive has to be sensed in sensibility. So via your senses, via touch, taste, smell, vision. But this implies a problem for Kant because we don't question these conditions, which means to say that it's exactly the same as putting on some blue-tinted spectacles, in that because we have to assess the world and analyze the world via our senses, we are basically viewing it through blue-tinted spectacles, which make everything blue. So Kant's point is we're never actually addressing the real. The whole reality is subjective to the subject because he has to process it via these senses. And so from that, everything is a re-presentation. It's not the original real presentation, it's a re-presentation. So that then means that the subject, the human, is in a subjective position. Their reality is ideal. It is entirely created by the way that they synthesize things. So then you can sort of box off. If you think about it in your mind, or maybe even draw it, if you draw this is a very, very, very rough way of thinking about it, but if you draw a huge square and within that you draw another square, and the smaller square is the subjective reality of a human, or the subject of a man, and the larger square is the objective reality. It's all of experience. The way in which the subject is experiencing that entire is subjective. They experience it in a certain way. This then means they're sort of boxed off. They're in their own reality, which is constrained by the way they sense things. So you could then say, if you take the definition of transcendent as something which goes beyond, it's not as if the subject is going beyond the entire. The subject is going beyond, is transcending the subjective reality via a schizophrenic process just to get into that transcendental reality. So it's not this sort of classical transcendent, I've transcended the entire cosmos and I've met God. It's transcending a subjective mode of synthesis via using a schizophrenic process which has connection already to that larger box, that transcendental reality. And so in that sense, you have the notion, but all these things are still immanent. They're still all flat. So it's not, transcendent in that original sense. So you can transcend, but it's within something. You're not actually getting out of the bigger thing, but you are transcending something. And what you're transcending is the mode of synthesis, which is beholden and is mandatory to man. I hope that makes a bit more sense. Someone, Aeon, has just put a section from Difference and Repetition to sort of help with the elaboration of the interpretation of the virtual. So the section from Difference and Repetition, which for those of you who don't know is Deleuze's work, individual work, where he says the virtual is not opposed to the real, but to the actual. The virtual is fully real, insofar as it is virtual. Indeed, the virtual must be defined as strictly a part of the real object, as though the object had one part of itself in the virtual, into which it plunged as though into an objective dimension. The reality of the virtual consists of the differential elements and relations along with the singular points which correspond to them. The reality of the virtual is structure. We must avoid giving the elements and relations that form a structure an actuality which they do not have, and withdrawing them from a reality which they have. And so this was sort of coming back to the idea of the virtual and the actual, which I gave in probably one of the really early ones, when very, very quickly, if we took a ceramic mug as our object, in its actuality, we understand it in the phenomenal sense, which I was just talking about with Kant there. It's an actual object in our materially real reality, and its existence then has actual attributes which are singularly specific to that object. Its virtual attributes are transcendental in the sense that they are the habits, the traits, even the customs, and the connective and communicative attributes of that object. So when we think of an object as hard, well, that denotes something which is connective to something else. Its hardness. So that implies this connective. But also there's a far wider and more complex idea of virtuality with respect to potentiality. So these virtual aspects, someone gave a great example in the first lecture, I think, of you have the virtual aspect, the actual aspects of a tree, for instance. The actual aspects of a tree are hard, and it has bark, it's rough, but these are very singular and they're phenomenal and they're actual. The virtual attributes, sure, you still have hardness and roughness, they're transferable, but you also have the virtual attributes, which a really good way to think of them is as potential for the object. So it has this virtual potential to become a table. Okay, it has virtual potential to become, a wooden spoon, something like that, and far, far more. And I think for Deleuze and Guattari, something inherent in Oedipalization is the containment and constraint of virtuals, and what we actually, when we look at objects and when we look at people and things and customs, what is happening is that the virtual attributes of something are just getting constrained and constrained more and more and more, to the point where certain things only have a very, very limited function, which is sort of applies to familial etiquette, to what families consider normal, to what society considers normal. And for Deleuze and Guattari, there's something to be said at looking at something and understanding that there's far greater virtual potentiality for that thing. Where was I going with that? With respect to what we're talking about, psychic and social repression, this is sort of exactly what we're on about in a transcendental setting. Okay, so the way in which the schizophrenic transcends the subjective reality is by pushing those virtualities, taking a line of flight, pushing those virtualities to such a limit that the potentiality alters and actually then reactualizes as something completely different. And this only happens in a transcendental way. You can't do this. You can't. It's not like I can suddenly take a mug and just suddenly transform it into something. What has to happen on a conceptual level. And Gilles puts in that example that I've used before. What's the use of a broom? It depends. Do you want to sweep with it, or do you want to break a window with it? And on an actual level, you can change that, and there is something virtually changing there. But the actuality of the broom is still the same thing. So you're using this object which was never built for that virtual purpose. So there's something to be said there. But then also on a conceptual level, then you could go and then reinvent and innovate towards something else. This is more of like a material, almost like an engineering argument. But with regards to social and psychic repression, which we're on about, we're talking about the repression of the virtual is in relation to sort of arguably actual repressions which are happening on a familial and a societal level, which say, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that, this is what's correct, this isn't. But as Bill states, a change in the actual is a change in the virtual. A change in the virtual is a change in the actual. They can't be without each other, and they're both just as real as each other. But I would sort of, I don't know, I'd push that there's almost because you're working with transcendental, there is these inherent limitations on the side of the subject with respect to the actual, which is working within the phenomenal reality.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I don't want to go so far into difference in repetition now, because I think a lot of people are going to be confused, considering it was not part of our reading, at least. So the role of the body without organs, at least, so this is my interpretation about how I see them using the term virtual here, is because when we understand what the role of the body without organs is in this book, it's to do with the system. I read it almost like a command center, in the sense that you have desire and production, that's breaking flows, intercepting flows, connecting flows, blah blah blah, all that jazz. And it's also producing anti-production. Desire and production eventually leads to produce anti-production. All that stuff's happening. But where's the movement going, right? Where are the flows going? Are they going left or right? Are they going up or down? Blah blah blah, something like that. That question is what the body without organs asks. Because what the body without organs does is it's a recording apparatus for all the previous it's a recording apparatus for all the previous connections that we had. So they give the great example, the schizophrenic table. The schizo, what he's doing is the schizo is in this continuous process of desire and production, but the table is only really actualized. I mean, I don't want to use actualized because it might confuse, but the table is only created when there's a production of anti-production, which leads to a disjunction. And when these machines get disjuncted in this production of anti-production that happens at desire and production, these they turn into signs, in the sense that they can either be recorded or they could be repulsed. Now, when they're recorded, they turn into a sort of potential for, that's why they use the word numinal, right? That they can be a potential for the movement of desire machines. So what you have is, you don't have, and they say it's asignifying semiotics, right? Guattari later goes and he creates a whole new system of diagrammatic signification, which goes further into like the capitalist unconscious and stuff like that. But at least for now in Anti-Oedipus, what we have is a system of signification that works more as a network, since the chains are asignifying. And this network is essentially, when the desire machines ask, where should I cut the flow? Where should we break the flow? The body without organs, this network, is essentially what directs these flows into certain locations. And in that sense, it holds the key to their potentials. What happens is when you get, what combination of psychic repression in the family and social repression from the prohibition of incest, when these things combine together, desire and production, the body without organs gets an Oedipal recording, and from this Oedipal recording, it decides to go into an Oedipal direction, because that's the signal that the body without organs has given to desire and production, and it's gone into these sort of directions, or the potential has changed into a different kind of potential. At least that's how I see them using the word potential. It's that very practical question of where to cut and break flows that happens from that potential on the body without organs. And that's what I think they're meaning when they use the word virtual. It gets really confusing, at least once you get to their description of in 1,000 plateaus, and they talk about the virtual of the body without organs in 1,000 plateaus, because that's essentially that's essentially what they're using the body without organs to describe an ethical notion, and then that they use the virtual in that regard to say, how we should experiment with intensities, and that's how they use the body without organs as a base for experimenting in terms of an ethical practice of living in this regard.
Bill, I'm just wondering if you saw the questions by Svavel in the chat there. Difference between the virtual and the intensive. How do they relate? There's a lot of questions there, and I think you seem to know the intensive quite well.
Yeah, the thing is that I don't really want to go into this. This is going to be like, I don't want to go on a long tangent explaining a difference in repetition in this regard. I can try and explain it after, but I don't think it's necessary for at least what we're doing here, because the intensive states in Anti-Oedipus, at least, it's what it's referring to is in the sense that, the reason I'm doing this is I don't want to really confuse everyone, but the intensive states, at least in Anti-Oedipus, is referring to the schizo so intensive states are created when that whole process of, at least in difference in repetition, here's how the order goes, right? You have the problematic field, then you have the virtual from the problematic field, and then the intensive, the intensive works by a principle of selection. And that's Nietzsche's eternal return, right? It's once of a principle of selection, which selects a certain part of the intent it selects a certain sort of, I don't want to use an attribute, but the intensive refers to a process of selection, where the virtual refers to sort of a solving of a problematic field. And that's the basic difference, at least, if I don't go too much into detail. At least, and in A Thousand Plateaux, in Anti-Oedipus, sorry about that, we get something with regard to the body without organs, which has this dual function of repulsion and attraction. And what you have is a buildup. And this buildup leads to different intensities being built. And so, it's a similar process in this regard, right? We went from the virtual and the body without organs to the body without organs moving something, and then the virtual leads to an intensive. The intensive, it has to do with the two sides of repulsion and attraction. And from those two sides, what we at least see in this regard is that we get the production of certain identities, or in a way that can be selected. So the intensities lead to, races, identities, familial determinations. It's essentially, how we understand subjectivity. So then we have the process of selection occurring, where the schizo can go and the schizo almost selects a certain intensity, and it associates with that intensity. In this case, that is understood with pure affectivity. They would regard that, I feel like I'm becoming woman. I feel like I'm becoming Negro. Where you experience these subjectivities in the sense that they were intensive properties that got selected from a virtual problematic field. I hope that helps, though. I don't. At least I'm trying not to go on a bad tangent here.
Yeah, I'm not really sure if I got all that. Got a little bit confused near the end.
Okay, we'll move on from intensities and just come back to this psychic social repression. And I think one thing to sort of focus on now, while it's being, even though the section is very short, is these notions of neurosis and psychosis, because we already have this notion briefly noted of becoming neurotic. Okay, so just to reiterate, in neurosis, the ego obeys the requirements of reality and stands ready to repress the drives of the id, and of course the id in classical Freudianism is the thing which you have the superego of the father, the great paternal phallic driving force of authoritative control. You have the id, which is the animalistic, not rage, but the compulsion to just want to rape, kill, and break every taboo going. And then you have the ego, which is like the societal form of ego, which sort of computes between the two of these and tries to settle them into a socially acceptable sort of ego standard. So neurosis then is repressing the drives of the id by way of, when someone becomes neurotic, they become obsessively attached to something. And in repressing the drives of the id, you're repressing, in very abstract, the creative, almost the creative desires and actions which could alter the virtuality of a neurotic thing to break it out of this sort of lock. And of course, the psychosis then is the ego under the sway of the id, ready to break with reality because reality has become too striated for that ego. So psychosis is a complete break in which one just becomes so pent up that they can no longer sort of be beholden to this. And I think, in terms of becoming neurotic, it's an interesting process as to why that happens and what is involved in that, and same with becoming psychotic. So yeah, I just wondered if anyone wanted to comment on that or add anything to that. No, okay then. Does anyone have any questions? We're up to an hour, so we've got one more hour on this. Has anyone got any questions on these sections, or it seems that people want to stick to the intensive and extensive, but as Bill says, like, one of the problems when we begin to talk about the transcendental thing is that on one level, the transcendental does arise here with schizophrenia and things along those lines, but there's so many other directions of this book with regards to probably quite controversially psychology, even though people would probably avoid that, anti-psychology, society and sort of everything else. So this is sort of seems to be a primarily social and psychological chapter, so it'd be good to stick to those things. But yeah, if anyone's got any questions or things to say, please do.
So I've got something maybe to bring us back to some direct text analysis. So we've been sort of juggling with the question of that is sort of posed at the start in the preface, even by Foucault, where it's how do the masses begin to desire their own repression? And in the section 7 of Social Repression and Psychic Repression, on page 114, we just have a really interesting quote, and I think it's might be useful to work out one of the paralogisms so we can sort of get an idea of what a paralogism is and how it functions in this text. And so bottom of 114, we get an explanation of displacement. And so I'll just read, the law tells us, you will not marry your mother, and you will not kill your father. And we docile subjects say to ourselves, so that's what I wanted. Will it ever be suspected that the law discredits and has an interest in discrediting and disgracing the person it presumes to be guilty, the person the law wants to be guilty and wants to be made to feel guilty? One acts as if it were possible to conclude directly from psychic repression the nature of the repressed, and from the prohibition the nature of what is prohibited. There we have a typical paralogism, yet another, a fourth paralogism that we shall have to call displacement. So right here we see how the use of paralogism, just as Kant uses it, is the classical use of an erroneous reasoning, because they say one acts as if it were possible to conclude from psychic repression the nature of the repressed. So the error, say, that Freud is making here is thinking that because he discovered repression, that his explanation of it is correct, and specifically that he can conclude what repression is from that fact. Because just because you're given the fact of repression does not mean that you can conclude the nature of it. But this displacing paralogism is where we will begin to, basically, we use this concept of displacement, we use this concept of an erroneous reasoning later on in the chapters. That's why it's important to work these out, is how is psychoanalysis classically reasoning poorly gives us a sort of a way into how we can critique without entirely rejecting psychoanalysis as we've been saying we are.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to add from this idea, going that you bring about trusting Freudian repression just because he quote unquote found it. One of the interesting points to bring in here is that in terms of this book's sort of historical context, is that one of the things Michel Serres states, which is probably one of the reasons he was so, one of the many reasons it seems that he was so forgotten, is because he states at one point, I didn't abide by the Marx-Freud superhighway which was going on at the time, right? And so 60s to maybe late 70s, specifically French philosophy is in sort of in bed with Marx and Freud all the time, Marx-Freud superhighway. And even though this book deals with both, it doesn't deal with both in any orthodox way, not by a long shot. And one of the, to put it very, very roughly, one of the points that Anti-Oedipus is making, that Bill made in an earlier lecture, is saying, well, Freud and the Freudian psychoanalysts and psychoanalysts in general says there's this thing called the Oedipus complex, there's this thing called castration, there's this thing called repression, there's these things, blah blah blah. We have this, and this, and we've worked all of these out, and this is how they work. And these are sort of unquestioned for a long time, and they're questioned in such a way that they're just sort of critiqued in a nuanced fashion, which still brings them back and say, it might not work that way, it might not work that way. Deleuze and Guattari are being extremely bold, I think, for philosophers in saying that, well, actually, are these really how it works altogether? Is the Oedipus complex even a thing? Who are we to trust this way of doing things? And once again, I sort of want to reiterate that it's not Freud specifically. I don't think that they're out to sort of kill Freud specifically. I think it's more the structure in which these things are given as a way to understand things. So it's like we have to have these Oedipal structures. It's very helpful language that comes from Freud, but I think if it had been anything else, they would have targeted that as well. And so back to repression with the idea of like familial or societal repression, as you were saying, it's like it's one thing to say, well, why is Freud correct? But what Deleuze and Guattari are saying also is that why is there a privilege on who's correct? Why would psychic repression be privileged? Why would familial repression be privileged, or why would societal repression be privileged? Why would there be a privilege towards one of these modes? Because in having a privilege towards one of these modes, you're instantly Oedipalizing it and saying, well, this is the way that repression works, and this is what we have to filter repression through to understand it. And this is what for me at least, this is what they're getting at, is saying, well, you can almost view all of these and the schizoanalysis in its inherent utility as something which doesn't adhere to identity. It doesn't adhere to the identity of a specific mode of analysis of the way in which the subject is understanding or analyzing its world. So the schizophrenic doesn't adhere to a singular or let's say a striated identity, and in that sense it seems to me that schizoanalysis doesn't adhere to the identity of a certain form of counselling, because it understands that by doing that you're immediately striating or further repressing some certain desires. And I think it's very bleak in that way, that it's like, well, all these people who've been psychoanalyzed or all these people who've been counselled, there's this underlying idea in Anti-Oedipus which I find sort of very, almost not cynical, but at least quite, I don't want to say depressing, but morose in a way, in that the relief and structure and support and help and health that the people who are counselled and therapized and psychoanalyzed, their conclusions where they go, I'm healed, I've worked it out, blah blah blah, these are riding and they are reliant on their prior and pre-assumed belief that the counselling and psychoanalysis that they're entering into is an objective form of truth. So it's like, oh, these people get what they're on about. They understand how to heal my mind. Therefore, the conclusions that they come to are going to be the conclusions which are correct. So it's like the whole idea of lucid dreaming and what do you call it? Free speech. When you're laid on the couch and just say what you want. It's like, well, whatever you apply to that, they're going to believe it because there's an implicit relationship of power that's going on in that room, in that there's already a social understanding and arrangement going on there. You're already being Oedipalized by attending to the idea that you should lay down on the chaise lounge of a psychoanalyst, right? So you're already in there. And then, of course, there's multiple factors of like sunk cost and status and social belief that you're going to abide to, and you're going to say, yeah, right, they've cured me, it's the Oedipus complex, or it's something to do with castration, or it's X or Y. And Deleuze and Guattari schizoanalysis, it's like, and this is super cheap way of thinking about it, but it's like the schizoanalysis is a radical holistic therapy.
Yeah, I mean, I would jump in for a minute. I mean, I really appreciate the fact that Chance Richmond actually went to that part of the text, because I really wanted to go into that a lot deeper, because I think that's the real crux of their critique, or the kernel of their critique of Oedipus in this regard. So what Chance actually read out was their explanation of the fourth paralogism, which is the paralogism of displacement. And essentially what this is they're looking at the relationship between social repression and psychic repression. And so in this regard, I mean, I hope I'm more clear than I was in the introduction, because I think I was going all over the place there. But so essentially, this is like the most important issue so if you go back to the way psychoanalysis has treated issues in repression, is there's always been a primacy put towards psychic repression, and social repression has always been treated as the secondary thing. So the prohibition of incest was, so if Freud was analyzing, why do we have a prohibition of incest that occurred? Freud would go and say was that, oh, that just occurred because, it was a protection against the return of the repressed. And, it's human nature, right? That we're all disposed to go and fight through our own Oedipus complexes. That's just our natural progression as developmental species, blah, blah, blah. So essentially what Deleuze and Guattari are doing here, and they say Reich was the first person to do this. Reich was the first person to ask the question of, no, hold up, let's say that social repression comes first and psychic repression is a secondary to social repression. However, the problem with Reich is, Reich doesn't have their convoluted, I'll say convoluted, but metaphysics of desiring production, which allows them, to create an immanent, to remove the schism between libidinal economy and political economy in this regard. But the key move here is that, it's not this thing of human nature, or, as the Lacanians would say, oh, we're bound to this lack, so the role of analysis is to get everyone to enjoy their symptom, blah, 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 blah. It's the complete orthogonal of that. What they're saying is, so there's a social repression, and the social repression is the prohibition of incest. And the prohibition of incest is what causes desire to feel guilty, and from desire's guilt, it's desire essentially goes and says, that's what I wanted, and it turns into desire for what was originally repressed. And desire, now the reason, so then there's a real practical question that comes along here. How is it that desire can be changed so easily? How is it that social repression is able to do this, where desire is just like that, it just gets switched into something else by just saying, by prohibiting something, you now desire it. It's very strange even to think about it. So what they say is, it's because of the role that the way social repression uses psychic repression. And now psychic repression happens at the apparatus of the family. And the family, what we'll notice is, since the body without organs records pretty much everything, or so, I mean, I don't want to say that, but the body without organs doesn't decide whether what they're recording is something that's going to be beneficial to the organism, or what they're recording is going to be detrimental to the organism. The body without organs is essentially essentially recording everything, and and in this regard, despite the fact that it still also repulses, it just can repulse too. But and when we have the familial process in this regard, psychic repression, like the whole example of whole objects or the extrapolation, all that sort of stuff, that stuff can be recorded too. And from that process of recording, what happens is you create a psychic subject who's essentially docile, and thus there you work back into that loop that now social repression can become easily, you'll easily be forced into that sort of structure. And then from the last part you're repressed once again. It was just from the funniest part, which is that now you can't even commit incest also, even though your desire was both created by the repression, and you have to also repress it from that repression. That now you have to also say, because there's a prohibition that now you can't even have that incestuous desire. Now you just have to live this Oedipal subjectivity, in the sense that you have the symptom, and the symptom expresses itself in different ways now. And I like to read this part out because it makes it clear a bit. At least for me, it helped. So what they say is that instead we have before us a system of three terms where this conclusion becomes completely legitimate. Distinctions must be made. The repressing representation, and I translate the repressing representation as the prohibition of incest, which performs the repression, the repressed representative, and the repressed representative is actually, it's the repressed representative is so essentially the repressed representative is desire and production, and which the repression actually comes to bear. Displaced representative, it's Oedipus complex, which gives a false image of what's actually happening, and thus we get this tripart, almost semiotic system where we have a signifier, which is the prohibition of incest. We have a sign, we have a signified, which is essentially the Oedipalized desire, and we have a referent that's been crushed, which is the imminent or germinal flux, as they describe it, of desire and production. And that's essentially how the law works with social repression and psycho repression. I think on the Penguin edition, by the way, it's page 115, on the top of page 115.
Yeah, I really actually like that you're bringing that up, because it connects to sort of on the next page on 116, we have the quote that desire does not threaten a society because it is a desire to sleep with the mother, but because it is revolutionary. It's interesting that we have to replace, or the Oedipal society, that is, replaces your revolutionary desires with the desire, as you said, Bill, to be docile and to submit to the Oedipalization.
Right, exactly, and we're going to see that when they talk about partial objects versus global objects, the phallus, or a transcendent use rather than a legitimate, or rather than a legitimate imminent use. The key thing is that once we reach this, what they talk about anthropology and stuff, what we'll see is that in anthropological societies, it's the way they do this is they you tell stories and stuff, and so you create sort of symbolic representations where there's that people have to fall back upon, so desire doesn't have their what they call the actually even like when I read this, I sometimes get like, is desire really revolutionary? It just seems like such a bold claim, but I'd say it gets clearer a little bit further what they mean, and so it's not just like something they're just pulling out of their asses for now. And yeah, I think that covers it. Wait, Trans Republic, were you trying to say something? So your mic was going on or off.
Yeah, I just have something to add that I picked up. So I remember from the Ethics of Psychoanalysis by Lacan. He has a quote there that he brings up from Paul from Romans that I just dropped in the chat, and I'll just read it. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead. I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. The commandment which was to bring life, I found to bring death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. So Lacan uses this to say exactly what Deleuze are saying, is that through the prohibition, you can identify your own desire. This is what psychoanalysis tells you. You want to fuck your mother. But what Deleuze and Guattari are saying is that that's just like the strict Oedipalization that is enforced when really it's representing your desire, but it may not be true. It's what is it they say on 115?
It's a displacement.
Apparent image that is meant to trap desire. Just wanted to add that in.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a great point. I really appreciate that quote also. I think the whole thing, at least this is like, I think there are major contention with Lacanianism, and the conservative side of Freudianism is that sense that live with your symptom. And you see that at least where Freud was, the whole idea with Freud was we have to make the conscious unconscious. We have to make the, as a Freudian slip, but we need to make the conscious conscious. The unconscious conscious. And the whole point about Lacanianism is actually you can't do that, because Lacan's whole idea was, no, you have to learn to enjoy your symptom. And it's like you're born in this way from your human nature. And that's sort of, at least this is why they say schizoanalysis is a revolutionary practice, is because they'll say that, no, it's not our human nature that sort of does this. It's these systems of representation that we have in institutions and society that cause this. And, we don't actually to change ourselves. We have to change the way these institutions impose this on us. And essentially, and that comes from that whole tradition of anti-psychiatry, like R.D. Laing and stuff like that.
That's a good example of how the psychic and social repression are actually linked for these two, is that in changing, say, your psychic issues of, the law wanting to kill your dad, fuck your mom, whatever it is, you can't actually just go to a psychoanalysis and have this one-on-one conversation where you personally are changed. There actually does need to be a radical change in the society around you, which helped produce and contribute and sustain your repression.
Yeah, it's also important to know that, and then they make this point really once you go into chapter 3, that you can't place like a higher, even though they say social repression is what's primary, right? It's the sort of repression that comes first, as opposed to primary repression, and hence the psychic repression is the tool of social repression. That's what it's what social repression uses to achieve its goal. But it's like you can't have Oedipus by having one or the other, right? So once we analyze like savage societies, their psychic repression is completely different. So, their sort of system, they don't have the familial complex or the familial apparatus of psychic repression as that social repression caused in terms of the nuclear family. What they have is a completely different system, and hence, we can't conclude that they're Oedipalized just by looking at the prohibition, right? We also need to understand how psychic repression responds to this issue. And so they're both equally important for the process of Oedipalization. And it's just the fact that social repression uses psychic repression to achieve its main goal of Oedipalization, to protect, to sort of remove that revolutionary desire in a way.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add? But it would be interesting to hear, as this book is dealing with Lacan, or anyone else who's more familiar with Lacan than myself, in what way Lacan theorized of these psychic and social repression.
Are you talking about like what? The thing about Freud, I'm more familiar with at least how Freud did it, right? Freud is the whole idea, and you see this in Civilization and its discontents, right? That essentially, so we have this natural Oedipus complex that we're all, every human is entailed to go through this Oedipus complex, and but there is a certain guilt in this Oedipus complex, and we psychically repress it. But there's certain returns of the repressed that occur in this stage of psychic repression. And what Freud would say about the prohibition of incest, or the prohibition of incest as a medium of social repression, is that these forms of that the prohibition of incest is just there to contain the the sort of social. I mean, it's there to contain the returns of the repressed. I think that's how he would phrase it, right? Anything that gets past that psychical repression system, like I don't know, you see it as like operations of thumb sucking and stuff like that. But the prohibition of incest is like a sort of secondary resort that comes to bear upon these returns of the repressed to help it. It's been a while since I read Lacan on those. I don't really want to go and explain. And I don't know really remember how he theorized social repression and psychic repression.
Okay. Yeah. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add, or anything that's confusing them thus far?
So at least the key thing that we're going to see once we reach, when we go back, please go back to the previous things and they go over the connective, disjunctive, and conjunctive. The main reason why I said we should read this chapter first is we'll see, why the problem in this case, at least in the sense that from these legitimate uses, because at least if you don't read this chapter first before reading the other ones, in my opinion, it seems like what they're talking about is such a minor issue. You'll be like, yeah, but what's the big deal? I think that was my impression when I read that. But what we'll see here, it's this process of these three aspects of psychic repression that occur in the nuclear family, what conforms to the three paralogisms, and then we combine it with this fourth paralogism of social repression, which uses these three paralogisms as its tool, and they all come together to create this mass Oedipus complex. What they're doing here is genealogical work, basically, and that's what makes them so nuanced, in my opinion, in the sense that they're affirming everything, and in the sense that they're going to go and do a whole nuanced analysis. They're not just going to say, "Oh, psychoanalysis made this up," right? They make it pretty clear. We have never for once mentioned that psychoanalysis made up Oedipus. The subjects already come Oedipalized because of our social conditions, and from and that's the genealogical investigation, that from these social conditions we'll observe how this process works, and how not only what psychoanalysis did, but how did psychoanalysis reach the conclusions it reached. And I think that's what makes it even harder to understand, but makes it very interesting.
I think there's also I can't believe we read over this, but it's a funny moment that might encapsulate some of the stuff we were talking about in a really quick way that D&G bring up, and it's the Jung joke that they say Freud can't handle. So on 114, just above the quote we read about the law, there's Freud couldn't abide a simple humorous remark by Jung to the effect that Oedipus must not really exist, since even the primitive prefers a pretty young woman to his mother or his grandmother. And so they follow up with, if Jung betrayed everything, it was nevertheless not by way of this remark, which can only suggest that the mother functions as a pretty girl as much as the pretty girl functions as a mother, since the main thing for the primitive or the child is to form and put into motion their desiring machines, to make flows circulate, and to perform breaks in these flows. There's actually quite a bit to unpack here. First of all would be the Freudian the sort of typical dogmatic Freudian couldn't handle this joke that, okay, Oedipus is a form of replacing one desire with another, in the sense that we would read on 115, because you're just taking this desire for a, say, pretty girl and replacing it with the mother in specific. But then D&G also give a quick jab at Jung for saying that this isn't where he betrays Freud. It's because Jung doesn't realize that also he's not correct, because not the pretty girl and the mother both function in the same way, which is in the sense of something that the desiring machine is directed toward. And so this is where Deleuze and Guattari are offering sort of a new take besides just taking sides of either Freud or Jung. They're saying they both had an error. Freud was replacing certain desires with other desires. Jung was sort of just fighting back against that, but then they are offering your sort of novel item of the missing link is the desiring machines.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think I, I, I'm not really well read in Jung, but I think if you guys are interested, there's a really fascinating volume by Christian Kirschlake. He did this whole massive study on, I think it's the most in-depth study actually that someone's ever done on Deleuze and Jung. It's like a full 200-page thing, but he goes in a lot of depth into all of this. Because Jung and Deleuze have a very complicated relationship. The orthodox, I mean, the orthogonalness of both of those thinkers, I think it's not as explicit as people think. Like, I think also like you could compare intensities. Some people compare intensities on the body with that organ through complexes. But yeah, that being said, it's a great observation. I didn't actually catch that when I read that. I mean, there's so many references in this that I always miss out. Like, I would be curious because it's just a question I have. Does anyone know that reference to Stravinsky that they're making on page 121 when Stravinsky declares before dying, "My misfortune, I am sure if it came from my father's being so distant with me and from the small amount of affection shown me by my mother. So I decided that one day I would show them." Does any of you guys, I'm just curious, does anyone get that reference? Because I've not been able to understand why they're using Stravinsky in this case. The pages on the Penguin edition, it's page 121, and it's the middle paragraph.
I think it's tied to sort of the following remark. So, if even artists give in to this, it would be a mistake to stand on ceremony and hold the ordinary scruples of a diligent psychoanalysis. If a musician tells us that music does not attest to active and conquering forces, but to reactive forces, to reactions to daddy mommy, we have only to play again on a paradox dear to Nietzsche while barely modifying it, Freud as musician. So I agree that there's a large ambiguity here, but I think where we would start picking at the clues is that I don't know how to understand this in if-then statement, but so the musician will tell us music does not attest to active forces, but to reactive forces. Then we only have to this play again is also a play on words because play as in music as well. So there's something here to do with the active and reactive forces, which I think we'd need to unpack, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I mean, the active forces basically comes from Nietzsche, right? His book on Nietzsche is all about the active forces. I mean, the active, it's all, you could read Desire and Production in the way that it's the active forces. And it's also, I mean, in Deleuze and Difference and Repetition, it's the way he gets away from Hegelian negativity, right? Where Hegel says that difference presupposes opposition. Deleuze says, I mean, he doesn't, so his critique of Hegel is pretty much the same thing as his critique of Oedipus, in this regard that, he affirms Hegel in his strange sort of way by saying that, it's not that difference doesn't presuppose opposition, but opposition presupposes difference. It's rather, he says that it's the primordial production of opposition that occurs rather than opposition that produces difference for Hegel. I mean, that's sort of his thing. But I mean, the way he does this is by looking at Nietzsche and active forces. And so the active force is essentially, I mean, it's best understood, at least Todd May has this really great example I like to give. It's this example of essentially the French Impressionist painters, right? When they did, I mean, there's this whole thing with the old classicists. They had this. I think somebody actually gave a really great example of this if you scroll up. But essentially, the old classicists, they had this whole. They were reacting to the old French Impressionist painters, and so they created this whole. Gallery of the refused, and the way they oppose them is by negation, by saying essentially these people are doing the wrong thing, blah blah blah, and they basically protested against it, right? They reacted to the Impressionist painters. Well, the Impressionist painters, on the other hand, I mean, one of the things they did is they didn't follow any strict teleology, right? They didn't have any end goal of disavowing someone or proving that someone's like full of shit in a way. What they had was they just wanted to produce art, and they were not actually, so they were not focused on reacting to some end goal or focusing on some end objective of destroying the other painters. What they did was they just wanted to produce, and so they just started producing art. And naturally, since they were just doing that, they naturally, by just producing a lot of art pieces, they automatically killed the old. It's almost like a secondary or epiphenomena to what they were doing. They automatically killed the old guard by essentially just producing new work, and then the public catches on, consciousness basically catches on to it after a long period of time, and they eventually realized, and so maybe the Impressionists were ahead of their time, but they eventually realized that, and they naturally then more people remember the Impressionists than the old classicists now, right? More people remember people like Van Gogh and stuff. So I think that's basically how the active force works as opposed to the reactive force. But I'm not sure actually how they're using it in this context. I struggle with that.
For some more hints to, so the start of the paragraph is, at times we say that Oedipus is nothing, almost nothing, and at other times we say that it is everywhere. He then says, to be sure, we have never dreamed of saying that psychoanalysis invented Oedipus. So his language is really precise here. We never dreamed of saying that psychoanalysis invented Oedipus. That's not to say that psychoanalysis can't, say, impose Oedipus in the place of one of your desires, the way that displacement works, where it replaces one of your desires with another. It's just that psychoanalysis itself does not actually invent the Oedipus, which is where I think we have something here. So everything points in the opposite direction. The subjects of psychoanalysis arrive already Oedipalized. They demand it, they want it more. And this is the demanding your own repression. And then it's newsflash, Stravinsky declares. So I think it's trying to show with the Stravinsky example that even, say, a active artist who is maybe, it depends on whether or not we would translate Stravinsky as active or reactive, but he is not a creator in the sense, like Freud as musician doesn't work as well because Freud didn't create this in the way you'd create a work of art from scratch. And also Stravinsky here is already Oedipalized in advance, is I think what they're trying to show.
Yeah, maybe. Thanks for that explanation, though. That helps at least a bit.
That would seem to make sense. The sort of use of active and reactive here is kind of unusual because, particularly if we're talking about Nietzsche, well, Nietzsche would, at least Deleuze would also sort of align the active forces quite often with music as sort of an expression of this creative potentiality that, and even you think of Stravinsky as a musician, like your sort of instinctive reaction would be to think of him as an active creator. I guess maybe the point Deleuze is making is that everyone in this sort of society he's talking about is Oedipalized in some way, even, I guess, even a musician who would be this seemingly innovative or creative figure like Stravinsky. So I guess that's where that sort of passage is a bit confusing. It's also difficult when we're trying to think of these earlier Deleuze concepts in the context of this book.
So there's something going on too in the next paragraph where it's no psychoanalysis invent nothing, though they have invented much in another way and have legislated a lot, reinforced a lot, injected a lot. All that psychoanalysts do is reinforce the movement. They add a last burst of energy to the displacement of the entire unconscious. So I think they're using displacement in the paralogical sense of replacing one desire with another. So the Oedipal desire exists, so the psychoanalysis did not invent it. However, they do the job of reinforcing that Oedipal desire and even replacing it or replacing other desires when it's maybe not necessary. Like from a clinical perspective, you could analyze somebody who isn't having an Oedipal neurosis or psychosis, but they would inject it, displace it with the Oedipal desire, which does exist, but maybe isn't the correct diagnosis in the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be careful though by saying. So I think I get what you mean by this idea of displacement. Yeah, that's exactly what they're talking about. But I don't think it gets the sense that they're taking one desire and replacing it. One thing that we need to understand is that it's a material flow, right? These flows are real, and they're a real thing in an environment. It's just that they're not. So they're like on a different field that we can't see them, but we can feel them. We can't see them, but we can feel them. That's why they say we feel them with affectivity or intensity. But the thing is that since these flows are real material flows, what actually happens is that you can visualize it, right? That it's a river that's moved in another direction, and so we had this germinal flux of desire and production going on, this productive schema, but through both the apparatuses of combined psychic repression, as the recording of Oedipal representations on the body without organs, and the combination of a prohibition of incest that allows psychic repression to occur and which allows a guilty subject to fall into the displacement, the flows of desire are fundamentally moved, and they've changed their course, and they're flowing onto another direction, and then they're flowing into the direction of the mother, for example. And but then what happens is they later get repressed by the same prohibition, because you can't sleep with your mom, right? That's what the taboo states. And then we have then psychoanalysis. That's where psychoanalysis starts its practice. So this is essentially the genealogy of how what are the conditions that allow for psychoanalysis to come up with these ideas. So it's all these conditions, and finally we get to a stage where Freud can come and state that, oh, so the prohibition of incest was to deal with the repression, the return of the repressed. But it's what we're finding out is the assumptions that psychoanalysis makes, right? That we've found out that where does psychoanalysis begin its practice? Well, they clearly don't begin on a transcendental plane or a plane of immanence as Deleuze and Guattari do. They begin at this strange spot from these presuppositions that we are finding from these paralogisms now. And it's from this case that they say it's not that psychoanalysis created everything. It's just that the conditions, at least with the conditions of the conditions of political economy and the conditions of the divide between the nuclear family and the libidinal economy and political economy, and the conditions that we saw with regard to social repression and psychic repression were apt, and we were there for Freud to discover something very truthful. And in this regard, that this is how they're affirming Freud. They're saying, the conditions were right for Freud to discover this. And I mean, they're also insulting him here by saying maybe his discovery was not so great, by saying that, he was bound to discover something like this because, that's what the conditions were. People were fundamentally living like this in a way. And this is essentially what happened.
Yeah, I like the way you've sort of put it out. So maybe just so I'm clear, because I think I agree with you on this, is that there's on one hand the sort of slight critique of the psychoanalyst in the way that they, as you said, this is all material flow, so it's being directed like actual desires. Is you have a real desire towards something, the psychoanalysis will, through Oedipalizing you and the society itself which Oedipalizes you, take those flows and actually redirect them towards something else. And this is sort of the Jungian example of take the flow towards a pretty girl and direct it towards the mother in specific. However, they are also doing a thing of where, under what conditions, and how is it that Freud discovered this Oedipalization and was able to interpret everything according to an Oedipal complex. Is that somewhat on the mark of what you were saying?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was saying, essentially. But I mean, careful. I mean, so what you're talking about, what the imminent desire in production is. I mean, when they say about desire in production, and it's almost in its state of the schizo, right? Before it's been imposed by all these representations, which move desire into different locales, right? As you stated, right? As before desires moved into all these locales, desire in production works in the same way as Nietzsche's will to power, right? Desiring production is not destined to some object. What it is, though, it's just the libido that's inserted everywhere, and it's making all these insane connections. But what we see with psychic repression is there's a restricted use, and we start seeing how this creates lack and stuff, and all that jazz and stuff.
That's interesting too, because the Nietzschean will to power is obviously like a really popular concept, and I think maybe just while we're wrapping things up too, I could tie it, because Heidegger specifically has an interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power, where so in order for the will to power to will itself to power, like he's very clear, Nietzsche, and at least Heidegger's reading of it is that there is not a separation between the will and the power. It's not like there's a lack in the sense of desire having a lack in a lot of other understandings of it. The will to power already has the power, because the will to power wills itself. So it wills the will to power. The will to power wills the will to power. And it's always already in advance willed itself. And it's sort of the way that you're always already, say, Oedipalized into a situation, is that you're actually the Oedipalization, your will to your mother, for example, always already exists. And so the psychoanalyst who's analyzing these Oedipal situations, as much as they're discovering it or imposing it in the way that sort of Deleuze and Guattari are maybe critiquing to a degree, it's also already there. Like it's not like this is the point of them saying that Freud didn't invent Oedipalization. It was always already there. And they basically just willed it in the way that the will to power wills itself. Little complicated, but I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think the key thing is that it's about historical conditions, at least. So their idea is of free flowing libido as desiring production is essentially desire that's flowing in an environment and produces things. I mean, even lack is produced, right? I mean, you think about it ontologically. How do we understand lack? What is lack when we look at this as an ontological condition? Well, one way to think about it is the lack of water is dehydration. Now, where did dehydration come from? Well, it was produced. So Deleuze and Guattari will say that desire produces dehydration too when there's a lack of the real object. And this is sort of the way they say psychoanalysis produces lack when they start introducing things like phalluses and stuff like that, where they create an object where desire is not free to go in any direction at once, where desire is imposed over an object. And from this this is not from psychoanalysis. This is from the socio-historical conditions where we get certain things valorized in a way. And yeah, so that's exactly what they mean by when they say that, Freud. That's why they think Freud. This is almost their thing about Freud almost being like a joke, in the sense that the historical socio-economic conditions were perfect for Freud to discover Oedipus, and it's from this movement that we get the Oedipus complex, and we get the whole system of Freudian analysis. I mean, they can make a whole thing about how libido was just a discovery of the same way. There's this whole thing in chapter 3 when they start talking about, Kierkegaard. The only way Freud discovered libido was because, when we had Kierkegaard, who first stopped defining God as an object, but God as an abstract potential. So we call God faith. Or we understand labor power. We stop understanding wealth through wealth as an actual object, or we understand wealth through the power of labor. And Marx discovered this as the potential to have wealth through labor. And then we get to Freud and from all these discoveries of these, a potential energy, Freud understood libido desire not as desire for an object, but desire as libido that has the potential to have desire, essentially. And it seems like in this sense that essentially these historical conditions came together for the study of psychoanalysis in a way.
No, and that's okay. That makes sense. I agree with you. And there's something interesting you just mentioned there too about how, like, say the historical situation is going to determine our whether or not we're able to even discover these things. And I think it's interesting that by the time you get Marx, say, coming around and interpreting things as in this wealth as, say, specifically some forces of power or something like that over an actual like physical object, we have to remember, as you've been actually really good to keep reinforcing, that everything in Deleuze and Guattari is materialist. And so a good way to sort of exemplify how history determines these things is in history, wealth was physical objects. Like the king had a castle, the king had treasure. By the time you get into a modern day, the so-called kings or the bourgeois, what they have isn't always actually a material thing in the same way. It is a power of some sort, or it is like money nowadays is not physically gold in a chest. It's a number on a bank machine. It's still physical, according to, say, Deleuze and Guattari, but physical in a radically different sense, which changes the way in which we can understand wealth. So, which is why someone such as Marx would understand it differently.
Yeah, that's a great point. I wanted to get to this though. Transrepublic is asking a question. I came late, so I'm not sure what the question was asked. But what is primary, secondary repression versus primary/secondary, psychic repression or social repression? So essentially, now one can occur without the other, but in order for Oedipalization, both of them need to occur, and that's sort of their thesis. But so what happens is, so you have desiring production. That's the primordial base of all societies. But this is where their Nietzscheanism comes in full contact, right? When they start, this book's also going against a lot of theories of group dynamics, and this is also where their critique of Marx starts to show, right? That when groups form, when desire production starts going, when the molecularity of desire production starts to find molar group organizations, when groups start to develop, you develop forms of social repression start developing too. And what social repression is something like the prohibition of incest. But social repression couples with something like psychic repression, and social repression uses psychic repression as its tool. And in that case, social repression, the repression that social repression imposes over desire to cause desire to flow in an Oedipal direction, is caused both by social repression and the organization that social repression delegates for psychic repression. So social repression works in tandem in a way with the social organization, and that's why we can state that the family is an organization of social repression, that the family works as a case of psychic repression, and then the role of psychic repression is to cause us to desire more social repression, in the sense that we are docile subjects, that once we have a prohibition of incest, we get moved so easily to go from the prohibited to desire what was actually prohibited. And this is the mass system that starts coming together. So the key move, at least for Deleuze and Guattari, as opposed to conventional psychoanalysis, is to take that idea from Wilhelm Reich, that it's a social repression which comes first and psychic repression which comes secondary. But Oedipalization needs both of the processes to occur for Oedipalization to happen.
So in contrast to Freud, do they like invert Freudianism, where psychic repression is more primary than the social aspect?
Yep, they say that. So again, I like I said earlier, we can't say that one is more important than the other, because they really work in tandem. And like, that's why, in primitive societies we have a prohibition of incest, but those people in the primitive societies are not actually Oedipalized, and that's simply because they don't really have a delegated agent of psychic repression, in the case that they don't have a nuclear family. And at least what Deleuze and Guattari are saying is that uh, social repression comes first, and in psychic repression is social repression uses psychic repression as its tool to continue its mechanism. So in a way, you are right to say that they are inverting Freudianism there. I think they actually say it sometime, that we have inverted Freud. I think it's a direct thing that they actually say, if I remember correctly.
And psychic repression can just be shorthand for something like for individual, right? Or the self.
So it's a little bit more complicated, and it might seem vague now, but this is what they're going to talk about when we scroll back the chapters and we go to those connective conjunct, where they go into the three paralogisms of psychoanalysis regarding the connective, disjunctive, and conjunctive synthesis. But what they're going to say is that the body without organs, as a recording apparatus, will also record the representations that happen in the nuclear family, causing the schizo, or causing the individual to essentially have their desire machines being it's a sort of system of reference, or a potential that forces them to be situated in a realm of repression because they've recorded it. And that couples with social repression to and the key thing about psychic repression is that it's an unconscious thing that happens on the body without organs, and social repression is something, like you can see the prohibition of incest occurring, right? There's a whole law behind it, and then they work together to produce the Oedipal complex.
Right. Okay, so yeah, it's the self, but it can't be the psychic repression wouldn't occur without the social, so it's really not the self either. Not just the self.
Yeah, exactly. You need social repression. Yes, so social repression is what's primordial. It's not primordial, but it's what's given primacy for Deleuze.
Got it.
So we're at the last 5 minutes here. Is there anything anyone sort of wants clearing up, or just wants to quickly add in the last 5 minutes? It's been a pretty full-on session, but yeah, does anyone have any sort of final comments or final things they just want to add in? I think next week we'll probably just go back to where we were going to start this week, and this section should help us understand the three syntheses in a bit more clarity. So Daniel Ethics on page 121, translational betrayal. What does that mean?
I'm trying to look for that. Give me a minute.
Okay. I'm just going to finish up the recording here, but I think a few people will stay behind and probably answer that question. But I'll see everyone next week. So thanks very much.